Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex. Before we start, I want you to gather round, children, and I'm going to tell you about the early days of the internet. So, long ago, when I was a child, and we didn't consistently have cable, I could not just go online to find out what happened on my favorite TV show. There was no YouTube, really, to speak of that you could visit through Netscape Navigator to look up information about the X-Files. But in the early days of the internet, that is generally what I did if I missed an episode of my favorite show. I would actually use the internet primarily for the X-Files. The first several, the first few years of school. I digress. You get my point. But when I was a kid, the first thing that you learned how to use a computer with was the encyclopedia. They had this Encyclopedia Britannica that was installed on every computer, I think, at least in the libraries, in the area that I grew up in, and they would have you listen to this one song that was orchestral in nature, more like a marching band, and you would march around the library while listening to this and learning about the encyclopedia. It was very strange in retrospect, but at the time it was a lot of fun. It was a barrel of laughs. But this encyclopedia was installed on the hard drive. It wasn't even on the internet. So the internet was barely used when I was a kid in school. We used the computer to play Snapdragon and Number Muncher and things like that, but not for much of the internet. So in that time, when I did start using the internet, it wasn't for school, really. It was something that we had on the computers so that we knew how to navigate to Netscape Navigator. Think Internet Explorer's older, more obsolete cousin. And we would use this browser mostly just to know how to get on the internet. I think most of the rest of our computer lessons were skills in keyboarding and stuff, seeing who could keyboard the fastest or type the fastest. But back then they were called keyboarding lessons, not typing lessons. At least, not at my school. Who knows? But my point is that I did have access to the internet at school, even if they were not teaching me how to use it really. So one of the first things I found was this website that was X-Files in nature, and it would just tell you all kinds of stuff. When they added brand new clips of the audio from the show, I was elated. Granted, there were no videos back then. At least not on little tiny websites that were hosted by individuals having to pay a bunch for hosting and everything. But I would go and find pictures from the X-Files. I remember I printed out a pumpkin carving pattern from the X-Files and a whole bunch of other pictures, just to put on my wall as posters or to carve pumpkins from, I suppose. But the X-Files in and of itself was a huge part of how I came to know and love the internet. It was my whole reason for starting to use the internet. Which is kind of weird because it's something that we all take for granted nowadays. But back then, that's all I used it for. Reading old transcripts of episodes that I had missed because there weren't YouTube recaps or anything back then. The concept of spoilers didn't even exist. But, mostly, hey, I missed an episode of Supernatural, I missed an episode of The X-Files, let me go and read the transcript online at, Twiz TV or something like that. And that has always been really meaningful for me. And sometimes I still go back through and read the transcripts of episodes, especially if I'm just wanting to look something up and not really go watch it. Just about everything is on Netflix or Hulu or Amazon Prime nowadays, but there's still something nostalgic for me about going back through and reading an X-Files or a Supernatural transcript. The specific ones that I used to go and look up on my own when I was a kid in the early ages of the internet. And I find myself engaging in this from time to time. I've been feeling pretty nostalgic lately, especially in being back home with my family during this social distancing time and just reacquainting myself with the area in which I grew up. So this week, I found myself reading X-Files transcripts again. It was just something nostalgic that popped into my mind one day that I should do. And so, of course, as most folks do nowadays, I whipped out my smartphone and took a note on it for myself so that I could be reminded later. And I went online looking for some of my favorites. And while I love the episodes about the aliens and the syndicate and everything, the Monster of the Week episodes are still some of my absolute favorites. And if you've been listening to the show for a while, you may be familiar with that because I did cover the season 1 episode Squeeze back in April, I believe, in the early days of social distancing. And I really like that bad guy from that episode. So Eugene Victor Tooms, if you guys haven't listened to it or if you need a refresher, was genetically a mutant and also a serial killer. So he had something going on with his body that allowed him to squeeze through really tiny places that he shouldn't be able to go. Think kind of like Odo from Deep Space Nine, but he is not really dissolving into a pile of goo. He's more like squeezing or stretching. So more Reed Richards than Odo, I suppose. But he can get under a lot of the same things as Odo can get under, around, or through. And he also, as a byproduct of this, had a very low metabolic rate. And so he would hibernate for about 30 years at a time. And then when he would come out, he would feed on human livers. He would eat 5 human livers and then go back into hibernation. And he would make this gross little nest out of saliva and bile and newspaper. So we covered that in the episode on Squeeze. But lucky us, in the X-Files, there is a second episode with this guy. So I want to talk about that episode today. It is called Tooms, and it is rated as IMDb's number 15 on the list of the best Monster of the Week episodes of the X-Files. And its prequel, Squeeze, was actually number 10. So this guy in general is rated fairly highly, especially with the Monsters of the Week. So obviously the appeal is not limited to just me. And today we're going to talk about the episode Tooms. If you haven't listened to Squeeze yet, you can also go back to about the end of April, I want to say, and that episode will be in there under the X-Files Season 1, Episode 3, Squeeze. Now at the end of that episode, Scully and Mulder have actually caught Eugene Victor Tooms and are able to get him incarcerated. At least an approximation of that, because folks think that he's crazy, and instead of recognizing him as a monster that needs to be stopped like a serial killer, the way that Mulder and Scully and the old officer who's retired felt about him, they go ahead and put him in a sanitarium. It's called Druid Hill Sanitarium. And that's where we pick up in season 1, episode 21, Tooms. So Mulder and Scully have gone off and had more adventures together. They've gotten to know each other quite a bit better now. And now they are facing the possible release of this person that they know was killing people and eating their livers. But folks think that he's just kind of batty and instead are potentially going to release him. This episode was written by Glenn Morgan and James Wong. I absolutely love their work. Morgan and Wong have written some of my favorite X-Files episodes, especially the Monsters of the Week. And they have also, I believe James has written for American Horror Story. And Glenn Morgan has written for Final Destination and also that show on Amazon, Lore. These guys still often work together, and I am a big fan of their work. If you're looking for more great shows, or even just one-off episodes you'd like to watch, one of the things I like to do is go to IMDb and just click on the names of people who were in the crew of my favorite episodes and see if there's kind of a pattern there. Normally I notice it while watching TV anyway, but sometimes you get surprises. And then you go to the other episodes of other TV shows that they've worked on. Go to their personal page and then see what other shows they have directed or written for, etc. and check them out. It can be really fun to watch it through by director, in my personal opinion, as well as by writer. So, for example, if you go click on Glenn Morgan and James Wong and their collective works, then you will probably see a theme as to the types of stories that they like to tell. And then if you're into that for the X-Files and such, maybe check them out with another TV show. And that might be your end to the show instead of trying to start off just with season 1, episode 1. Start wherever your heart leads you by paying attention to the things you already love. I found a lot of really great shows that I would not otherwise have watched that way. So that's what I recommend. But this episode is also directed by David Nutter, who is a really great director. If you kind of recognize his name, that might very well be because he directed 9 episodes of Game of Thrones between 2012 and 2019. He's also directed an episode of Lost in Space, as well as The Flash, Arrow. He directed the pilots of both of those, but also Entourage, Shameless, The Pacific, Eastwick, The Mentalist, Terminator, The Sarah Connor Chronicles, as well as other shows like Nip Tuck, The Sopranos, Supernatural. He's done a lot all over the place, even all the way back with like ER and The West Wing, Smallville. He's done a lot of really cool stuff. And about half of it is sci-fi, and the rest of it is procedural drama. If you were into the Jessica Alba TV show Dark Angel, he also directed the pilot of that show. So you can see he also has a pretty good track record of writing pilots to shows that have been really important or at least loved in American culture. I'm not saying he's solely responsible for their success or anything like that, but rather that being associated with David Nutter means you have a really strong chance of getting your foot in the door. He also did the pilot for Supernatural, Without a Trace, and Smallville. Also Roswell, the one from like the 90s, not the new one that's out right now. What I am saying is that David Nutter has excellent taste in directing gigs. The man always produces quality products, at least from what I've seen, and I really love his work across many different TV shows. And I might not have necessarily put his name together for some of these if I had not gone to the website and looked, because like for Dark Angel, he only did the pilot. For many of these, he only did the pilot, or he did the pilot and one other episode. But they're still TV shows that got me hooked from the beginning. Shows that got me hooked by the pilot, even though the pilots for these shows had different writers. It's part the writing style and part the visuals for me. I don't know how other people have that proportioned in their head is what I'm getting at. But for me, it's, kind of a 50-50 balance, actually. It's partly about the story, but also I want to be able to get immersed in the world. And a large part of that is done by the director. So I really enjoyed these, is what I'm saying. And their common thread, aside from being sci-fi or speculative fiction in general, is that David Nutter directed these episodes. So if you guys are curious about his work, you can also go to his IMDb page and check out his episodes. Or maybe just do an episode rewatch through Game of Thrones or The X-Files, etc. that are the episodes that he did. Maybe you'll notice some fun patterns, or maybe you'll just enjoy the episode. Either way, honestly, you win. It's a win-win for you. Alright, we're gonna go on a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about precisely where in the sanitarium we are picking up with Tooms. Stay tuned.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were discussing the writers and director involved in this episode. They are some of my favorites. I can never give them enough lip service. And if you're trying to put together a new list of ways to watch your favorite TV shows, a new theme, I suppose, and you don't want to go just Monster of the Week. That category is very expansive for the X-Files. You can narrow some of it down by looking for the ones that are strictly Glenn Morgan and James Wong as the writers, or look at episodes that were just directed by David Nutter. I find that to be a very fun way to reorganize the episodes I watch in a manner I normally wouldn't. And it also helps me watch episodes that perhaps weren't necessarily my favorite, but that I've been sleeping on for a while because they weren't part of my normally themed rewatches. So, now we are going to pick up with where Tooms is at the beginning of this story. Keep in mind, he was caught by Scully and Mulder a year or less before now. So he was caught in episode 3 of season 1, and he's popping up in episode 21 of season 1. So a lot of time has passed. Mulder and Scully are learning to at least respect each other and trust each other, even if they both think the other is being absolutely ridiculous at certain times. But they know each other better now when they encounter Tooms this episode than they did in Squeeze. So in Tooms, we start out with seeing Eugene Victor Tooms at the Druid Hill Sanitarium in Baltimore, Maryland. So he's not that far away from where Scully and Mulder are in the DC area. And a doctor named Aaron Monte has shown up to check on him. So he's supposed to get a review the next day about whether he still needs to stay committed to this sanitarium, whether he's free to go. It's like a parole hearing almost, but instead of jail, it's for being in an asylum or a sanitarium. And this doctor, Dr. Monte, tells Tooms through the door that he's looked at the statements of the other doctors who are going to be testifying the next day, and he thinks that this is going to go pretty well for Tooms. He tells him, I think that you're probably going to get released tomorrow. So, poor Scully and Mulder would kind of be over here like, what am I, a joke to you? But, that's our justice system for you. So Tooms is very happy that he is going to be let out, but Tooms was just about to go through that food slot that they have in those sanitarium doors to unlock his cell door. I don't know how long he's necessarily been in there. Perhaps he was just released from being in a straitjacket most of the time. I'm not sure. But anyway, Dr. Monte just narrowly missed Tooms trying to escape through that food slot. So, it's probably a good thing that he walked over there at the time. Not that it really matters, because Tooms could do it again right after the guy leaves. But he's like, I guess maybe they won't chase me. At least I think that's probably what he thinks. Tooms is very creepy in that he also does not talk a lot. And the way that the guy plays him is just very, very unsettling. He's played by Doug Hutchison, and he does an amazing job at making you feel incredibly creeped out. He's not really a surprise as a bad guy in this episode, as most episodes are. Like, a lot of that in the X-Files is the reveal of getting to see the fluke man, or to finally get to see what the aliens look like and stuff. They're big on those surprises. And those generally have a really big payoff, don't get me wrong. It's actually how big that payoff usually is that's part of what makes Tooms so surprising to me in how good it is, and how much I love it out of all of the seasons of the X-Files. And that's exceptionally remarkable considering that there's over 200 episodes of this show. And there are multiples from season 1 alone that stand out as being in the top episodes of the entire series. That's wild to me. Y'all know how I feel about first seasons of shows, and how oftentimes I acknowledge that first seasons are kind of not great. That's not the case for the X-Files. I know we have talked about JAG and some other shows in the past in that regard, but with the X-Files, they came out swinging, and they didn't stop, y'all. It was a great show. I don't know where I was going with that metaphor, so we're just gonna let it die a natural death. But it was a great show from the beginning, is what I'm saying. And that's one of the reasons that show stands the test of time for me. Some of my other favorite shows, I will almost always skip season 1 when I go to watch it. I don't need to learn about the characters or see things that they forgot to put in the show's Bible that got missed by continuity as well. I don't need to see all that or see the characters get to know each other. I want to get in there when they already know each other really well, and we're getting to see what the inside of their living rooms look like and stuff like that. Also, I often just watch my own favorite episodes. I'm sure everybody does that. But what it means, for me anyway, is that when I rewatch shows, quote, from the beginning, unquote, I don't necessarily start from the actual original beginning, not the air date, and not the production date either. I'm not even just swapping around the order of these. I just often pretend that season 1 didn't happen and that we're just jumping in season 2, knowing these people already. It's actually not even pretending. I'm not putting that much thought into it, but you get where I'm coming from. My point is that I don't rewatch those often, but whenever I start with the X-Files, I will start with episode 1. And I don't have to skip further than episode 1 into the X-Files to get someone else hooked to the show. It's just the magic of the show. But if you're looking for something from season 1 to get them hooked on, then I think that Squeezin' Tooms is also a really great option. You get to start with episode 3. You're not missing much. And then we get all the way up to episode 21. So you're preparing them for this new relationship that the characters have, but you haven't gone all the way into season 2 yet. I think it's beautiful that it's still in season 1. And that's another reason why this is one of my favorite episodes and one of everyone's favorite Monster of the Week episodes. Tooms is super creepy, but, we leave him the night before his review board meeting for his commitment to the sanitarium. And we see that over at FBI headquarters, Scully is meeting her new supervisor, Assistant Director Walter Skinner. So this is where we really get to meet Skinner, and honestly, if you don't get to see Skinner in the show, is it even worth watching? Yes, it's still worth watching. It's totally all still worth watching. That's the beautiful thing about this show. You can still watch the first 20 episodes without one of my favorite characters, and they're still amazing. But we've already established that there is a secretive government agent named the Cigarette Smoking Man, or credited at least as the Cigarette Smoking Man, who pops up in the background, and he's just kind of chilling there smoking a cigarette most of the time, because back then in the early 90s you could smoke indoors in many places. But also, you get the sense that the Cigarette Smoking Man would smoke wherever he wanted, regardless. That's part of his swagger. But he is in this episode too, so it's introducing Skinner and reacquainting us again with the Cigarette Smoking Man, showing us he's going to be in the show a lot more. Skinner is telling Scully that she wants her reports to be more conclusive, which is upsetting for Scully. She's doing her best. There's just some things she encounters with Mulder that she doesn't have a good read on. Mulder's clearly not crazy, but Scully also can't wrap her mind around these things that he's seeing. She firmly believes there has to be a scientific explanation for this. But she has to write a report regardless, right? So Skinner's not happy that sometimes Scully's like, I don't know. And I think the best extension of this episode and this interaction with Skinner that we get to see is later on, seasons later, in the episode Bad Blood with Luke Wilson. It is another Monster of the Week episode, and it is also a comedy. And it has Mulder and Scully sitting in Skinner's office, and they each tell their side of the story of what happened. And they're wildly different, including impressions and everything. It's very funny. But Skinner is just so fed up with both of them because he's like, Scully, you came over here to debunk this guy's work. I need a conclusive report. I need something actionable in like management speak. And Scully's like, boss, I am doing my best, but it is what it is. So this is frustrating for her, I think, because Scully's always been at the top of her class and everything. You can tell she's very bright and very much a type A personality. And her boss is telling her that these reports are not conclusive enough. But by the time we get to the Luke Wilson thing, Scully's just like, dude, I don't know what to tell you. Like, you know the drill now. And Skinner's like, God, more really weird reports that aren't technically conflicting, but that are still not at all what I wanted. I've been a manager. If you've ever been a manager, I can understand why Skinner would be so frustrated with them. Mulder causes him a lot of problems on his own, so poor Skinner just pretty much has constant headaches. But he also tells Scully he wants more by-the-book procedures. And that's hilarious to me because that is what Scully lives, eats, and breathes, is structure and order and doing things by the book and objectively. So this is kind of gutting for him to tell her, but Scully is doing her best and she is going to try. He also says that their conviction case rate is really high. It's at 75%. And Skinner tells her that that's the only thing keeping their department open, or whatever the X-Files is, their tiny basement office where all of the weird files go to die. That's what's keeping them open, or keeping them working on that assignment being available, I guess. But their conviction rate of 75% seems really high to me for people who are chasing down monsters and aliens. So I decided to look that up on the FBI's website. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about what that 75% solve rate might really look like for the X-Files, and also how that could even be possible given the FBI's guidelines and their actual encounters on the show. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about how Eugene Victor Tooms has only been in the sanitarium for maybe a year, and they are deciding to go ahead and let him go, and possibly, the next morning after his commitment hearing. But the doctor says he thinks it's really likely, and Tooms seems to believe him so much that he doesn't even try to escape. He's just going to wait it out for tomorrow. After all, that way they're not going to chase him. But also, if he doesn't get out tomorrow from the review committee, he can still escape the way he'd originally planned to, by squeezing through that food slot. We also learned that Scully is meeting Skinner for the first time, so this is her boss, and he's telling her that he wants her to have more conclusive results with her reports and stuff like that. And he also tells her that the only reason the X-Files is still open as a department is because they have a 70% case solve / clearance rate. So I was kind of curious about that because that seemed pretty high to me, especially since they are looking for aliens and monsters and stuff, or not even looking for them necessarily, but they're finding them because this is just where all of those weird cases went. So I was like, what exactly does it take to close an FBI case? So I went to ucr.fbi.gov and read up about it. So there are a couple of different offenses clearing stuff. So this is from the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting Program, their UCR program. And in this program, law enforcement agencies can clear or close offenses in two different ways. You have to pick one or the other. The first is by arresting the person, and the second is by what they refer to as exceptional means. Some cases can get closed administratively, but that doesn't mean that it's UCR closed. It's just closed administratively. But technically it's not a closed case. It's just no longer being pursued. So in order to get it cleared with the UCR program, you have to meet certain criteria. And the first are for being cleared by arrest. So in order to be cleared by arrest or to be considered solved for crime reporting reasons, there are 3 things that have to be done. At least one person has to have been arrested for this crime, charged with the commission of the offense, and been turned over to the court for prosecution. And it says whether following arrest, court summons, or police notice. So it can meet that last criterion contingent on any of those 3 different agencies or scenarios. When they calculate this clearance number, like what Skinner is giving Scully of 75% for her and Mulder, with the UCR program, it calculates those clearances based on the number of offenses that are cleared, not the number of people arrested. So if you get one person arrested for a body of crime, say like armed robbery, so maybe they also shot a hostage, and, holding up a bank already illegal, having a gun while you're doing it extra illegal, things like that. So there's multiple charges involved. In that scenario, you only have to arrest a minimum of 1 person in order to consider that closed. So arresting 1 person can mean that several criminal offenses get to be cleared through UCR. But also, if you arrest a lot of people for something, that might still only clear a single offense. So say you and 10 of your best friends decided to steal a rock star's RV to go joyriding. There's definitely room for all of you in that RV. That is a joint decision that you've made to do this. But even if they arrest all of you for it, it's still only 1 offense. It's Grand Theft Auto. At least as I understand it. Just roll with it, for the sake of the example. Interestingly, there are certain clearances that an agency records in a particular calendar year that may actually pertain to offenses that occurred in previous years. And that to me sounds like that's really a living, rolling number. So at any time, if you have a cold case or something from 2009 and you happen to solve it now, instead of it going to the solve rate for 2020, it's actually tied to the crime itself, which was committed in 2009. So I think that would then change 2009's number instead of 2020. Does that make sense? That's my understanding of cleared by arrest. On the other hand, you have cleared by exceptional means. And so this one, I think, is probably why the X-Files has such a high clearance or solve rate if they're talking about these UCR program type numbers. By exceptional means, they mean that there are certain situations where things happen that are beyond the control of law enforcement. And these things prevent the agency from arresting and charging the offender. So whenever that happens, that means they can clear the offense exceptionally. So the law enforcement agencies that use this do have to meet the conditions that are laid out in order to clear that offense. They need to have identified the offender. They have to have gathered enough evidence to support an arrest being made, make a charge, and turn the offender over to the court for prosecution. They also have to have identified the offender's exact location so that the suspect could be taken into custody immediately. And finally, fourthly, they have to have encountered a circumstance outside of their control that prohibits them from arresting, charging, and prosecuting that person. So, is this person fled the country? That might apply. Has the person died? That would definitely apply. So examples of exceptional clearances are things like the offender having died. That doesn't matter if it is suicide or suicide by cop or justifiable homicide or straight up homicide or even natural causes. No matter why the person has died, if they're dead, you get to clear it as being of exceptional means. So you can also clear it for this reason if the victim refused to cooperate with prosecution after the offender has been identified, or if they have extradition denied because the offender committed a crime in another jurisdiction and is being prosecuted there for that offense. And there's also an exception in the UCR program, and it says that the recovery of property alone does not clear an offense. Just because you get something that was stolen back doesn't mean that a crime wasn't committed. But those are the types of scenarios in which you could clear something for being of exceptional means. So if we think about that with the X-Files, there are several scenarios that could be applicable to. Like in season 1, sometimes they go in to find what's making everyone crazy or who killed somebody, and they find out it was these weird little worms from beneath the ice, some parasites. Or they go in there and it's some type of bugs, like in Darkness Falls. Or, you get a clear rate for getting Tooms arrested, even though he ended up in a sanitarium. I think because he was taken before the court and deemed unfit to stand trial and such, that would also clear him, because all you have to do for that one is to get the person arrested, charged, and then taken to the court for prosecution to occur. So it hasn't even happened yet. So it doesn't matter whether the person is imprisoned or anything like that. The outcome of the case doesn't matter. They have done their part according to the UCR program rules by the time they give over custody of the person to the court. So, in the case of Tooms, that counts. In the case of, these creatures like the little parasites and stuff in ice, there's no one really to charge for that. Also, that's really hard to prove. I'm sure there was also a lot of inconclusive evidence in there, but that's probably enough to clear it by exceptional means, because everyone there has like a PhD or an MD in that episode, and they're all like, yes, this was definitely a parasite that got in our ears that drove us all crazy. We are all in this one together. We are in full agreement that is what happened. Also, anytime any of the folks that they are after die, they also get to clear that. And in the X-Files, they're not killing anyone. At least not usually. Mulder is mostly just getting his butt kicked. He's really Captain Kirk like that. But also, many of these X-Files cases are also cold cases. So Mulder's getting a lot of really old cases. And we see that with The Unnatural, which is one of my favorite episodes, when he goes to speak with Arthur Dales to solve this mystery that has us really getting to see the bounty hunter aliens for the first time. And also Jesse L. Martin plays Josh Exley in that episode that was written by David Duchovny and directed by him, by the way. But it's also a really good example of these older cases Mulder works on, as is this case with Tooms. So in each of these, he's having to go talk to the now retired individuals who were associated with these cases back then, whether that was as a journalist or a police officer, etc. Mulder often finds himself kind of reaching into the past to solve some of these crimes, and whether that's because we have updated tech or he has this new perspective with Scully, who's to say? But overall, we know that at least by the end of season 1, that Mulder has a 75% solve rate with Scully for the X-Files. Now, to contextualize this, the numbers I was looking at on the FBI website that was also talking about the UCR program and whether they can clear the case by arrest or by exceptional means, it does also give some numbers for the amount of crimes by type that were solved or closed, cleared for either reason, by arrest or exceptional means. But in 2017, amongst the violent crimes, the murder and non-negligent manslaughter cases had a clearance rate of 61.6%. Robbery had one of 29.7%, and aggravated assault 53.3%. And then crimes like motor vehicle theft were at 13.7%. So this really tells me one overarching thing, and that is that Scully and Mulder are better at finding aliens and monsters and giving the government some type of answer for it than anyone is at, working on solving murders and stuff. I think that if that were the case and these things were both real life, that Mulder and Scully would likely get reassigned to perhaps working on some of these other areas that needed help with their clearance rates. That's kind of bananas that they are able to clear 75% of their cases, and they're doing that based on like these monsters of the week that they are finding, and also their findings on aliens and the shadow government. That's wild. Mulder would have been murdered by the CIA a long time ago, I think. Or, they would have also just repurposed him so that he was maybe working on larceny or something, because that one had a clearance rate of 19.2% in 2017. That one's a property crime, not a violent crime, but I'm just giving you all the numbers here. So I find that to be very amusing that they had Mulder and Scully's clearance rate so high. But I suppose that for lay people who aren't familiar with this, that is a good enough number, I suppose. I had no idea when I watched it the first time when I was 5 or something, that's what they meant, was that they had a rate that was good enough to warrant it not being closed, and that they had a good solve rate. But I would have thought that that was maybe not an entirely great solve rate too. As a kid, you're just like, 75%, that's a C, or whatever. I know the show wasn't geared towards kids. I'm just giving you an alternative perspective. But regardless of where you stand on that line, it is bananas that their percentage rate for clearing cases that are cold cases and also related to aliens and vampires and stuff, a 75% rate. They have a 75% rate for this. And I'm not saying that the actual FBI should have higher numbers. I am not a law enforcement agent. I don't know anything about this beyond what I read on this UCR website and these specific clearance figures. I rather mean that if we take this information of the actual percentages of crimes that are cleared by arrest or exceptional means from 2017, and we say, well, this is the number that Mulder has in the X-Files, in this universe, maybe they also have these exact same numbers, like from 2017. That looks bananas next to each other. I would think that a bunch of other people were maybe slacking off, or that Mulder was just very, very smart if there was that big of a discrepancy between the solve rates for all of these crimes versus what he is solving with Scully in the X-Files. Granted, he is an Oxford-educated psychologist, but it just sounds crazy, This kind of thing did not even occur to me when I was watching this through the first several times. I've probably seen this episode at least 75 times. But this is the first time that this has bothered me. So if you were also interested in that and wanting to know those solve rates and how good Scully and Mulder really are at their jobs, well, it turns out they're really great at their jobs. They are rock stars. And if Mulder wasn't undermining the shadow government, they might have promoted him long ago. We're gonna go on a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to wrap up this episode with Tooms getting back on his BS. Stay tuned.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about FBI clearance rates for cases, how those are decided with their criteria, and how likely it would be that Mulder and Scully would be at a 75% rate for solving cases related to aliens and vampires. Now we're going to wrap up this episode with the rest of the plot. So we've already discussed a lot of the weirdness that's going on in this episode. There's a weird timeline. They're letting him out of the sanitarium, even though he is killing people and eating livers. Obviously, Scully and Mulder, despite their high solve rate, no one believed them when they said that this man was decades old and eating livers and going into hibernation. Then again, Scully might not have entirely supported Mulder on that one, just that Tooms was committing these current murders. But if he is committing current murders, and it's enough to put him in a sanitarium, I don't know why they let him out within a year. I don't make the decisions in our legal system. But here we are. I'm sure stranger things have happened. But Tooms has his hearing, and sure enough, everyone says that he is fine, that he doesn't have any signs of having physiological problems. Someone else says that Tooms probably attacked Scully because he was frustrated over losing his job and his false arrest, and so he was just lashing out in frustration. And then Mulder is there, and the judge dismisses his theory entirely. So Mulder is, of course, saying, hey, this man is a genetic mutant, and this man's fingerprints are at 7 of 19 crime scenes all the way back to 1903 if you stretch them out and elongate them like we did in the episode Squeeze. And the judge is just like, look, this guy does not look 100 years old. You cannot convince me otherwise. And then Mulder gets really belligerent, as Mulder is wont to do, and says that Tooms is a freak of nature and will definitely kill again if they release him because he didn't get the last of the 5 livers he needs before he hibernates for another 30 years. So, of course, Mulder actually is looking more like a candidate for commitment right now, yelling this at a sanitarium commitment hearing as they are about to release this person. So Tooms is just taking it on the chin, being creepy and weird, just kind of sitting there. So they decide Mulder is just wackadoo and not enough for them to involuntarily commit him. But I'm very surprised that no one really reached out to file a complaint with the FBI or something about what he was saying. But I digress. So they go ahead and let him go. They're like, he's not, hundreds of years old and stuff. This man is going to go ahead and be released. I don't think that he could have done this. So the judge lets him go. But he's supposed to stay under the care of Dr. Monte and then also return to his animal control job. Remember, he was picking up roadkill and then licking his fingers. And then also live in a halfway house with a couple named Susan and Arlen. So he's supposed to stay with the Greens while he is getting back used to society again, I suppose. And Mulder is really upset, and he's like, I'm gonna keep watching you day and night. So he does, even though it's pretty much harassment, and I'm pretty sure that's illegal too for him to do, even as a law enforcement agent. And Scully goes back to look through the old murders for a lead. I guess perhaps since there was a judge involved here, that Tooms was deemed necessary to put in a sanitarium for the duration of the time up to his trial. And it's at this point when he's being prosecuted that Mulder would probably want to be there because he wants to make sure that he's able to close this case. That's not to dismiss Mulder's bleeding heart or anything like that. He's definitely a man who cares very much, especially for the safety of other people. And so he would want to be there just to make sure he has everything, all of his ducks in a row, make sure the guy stays in prison. But also, in light of the UCR program guidelines we looked at today, perhaps the case would have been reopened if they were not able to get someone prosecuted. I'm not sure. I didn't see anything about how cases are reopened, so I'm not sure about that. But regardless, Mulder is at that hearing, so I guess this is just when he was able to get a hearing, which still seems pretty fast, for criminal court and all. But they release him, and Mulder is really grumpy about this. And Scully is arguing that going back and looking through the old murders for another lead would be unorthodox. And he gives her a hard time about being concerned about Skinner telling her he wanted her to be more by the book. So Mulder's kind of in his feelings and being a little snippy with her, but he is very focused on Tooms as well. His heart's in the right place, but he's being kind of a jerk. She has every right to her feelings in feeling weird about her boss telling her this. She could still be fired. Lots of people are fired for telling the truth, or despite telling the truth. But Scully follows Mulder's lead anyway and goes back to Detective Briggs, who had helped them in the previous episode, Squeeze, and also he's still at that Lynn Acres retirement home. And we talked about this guy and the retirement home a bit at length last time, because he was storing evidence there. He just has this old evidence from these previous crimes chilling at his house. The ethics of this, also custody issues, chain of custody issues, it really bothers me, but we already talked about that in the last episode. This bears a little bit of repeating, though, because when Scully goes to talk to this guy, this detective who helped them with the last time they encountered Tooms, and who also had worked on the case, 30 years before that, when Tooms had done this before, in between his hibernation periods. And as Scully's talking to him about this, like, guy, is there anything you can remember that would help us? He gets out a jar that has a human liver in it. It has a piece of a human liver in it. And they had found it at a local chemical plant when it was under construction in 1933, but they never found the dead body that was associated with it. So they thought that maybe this was related to Tooms, but they couldn't ever find the other bodies. Because with all the other victims, obviously, he only took the liver. That's all he needs to survive and stuff. So that's all he wants. So he goes and eats the livers, and then he goes back to sleep. I get it. I want to go back to my nap too, especially after a nice meal. And so this is also a sore spot for Detective Briggs. He thinks that this is related to Tooms, and tells Scully he thinks that Tooms buried the other body underneath the cement foundation of that chemical plant. And that if they're able to get the foundation of that chemical plant torn up, they might be able to find the body and match it to that tissue in the jar of the human liver that this old man has in his nursing home, by the way. And then that they can maybe get Tooms for this. But they aren't able to use those conventional methods that Scully really wanted to use. And Briggs just goes old-fashioned rogue cop. He has a hunch and takes the excavation crew to a specific spot in the building, and they dig up skeletal remains. But Tooms has, been out there picking up roadkill again, eating some snacks as he goes about his day, licking his fingers like it's got Cheeto dust on it, but it's roadkill. And just when you think he's gonna get someone, Mulder stops and asks if he's seen his dog that is a wolfhound that he uses to hunt moose for his hair. It's very silly, very Mulder, but Mulder knew that he was about to kill that lady, so he wanted to go ahead and call him out for it. So Tooms is really mad about this. He's hangry, you guys, and now he is following a businessman around and is being watched by Mulder, and dang old Mulder falls asleep on his stakeout. And when that happens, he wakes up to find Tooms' van empty, can't find him in the entire neighborhood, but he's able to see those context clues and prevent this family from being killed by Tooms, a businessman and his wife. And so then they go to the Forensic Anthropology Laboratory at the Smithsonian Institute. And the little forensic anthropologist in my heart is so happy to see this, and surprised to see it back in 1994. But that's awesome that they actually mentioned it, because that is indeed how that generally works. The FBI is partnered with the Forensic Anthropology Lab at the Smithsonian Institute, where biological anthropologists work in general, but also can do cases. So that's largely how that works, and then a couple of forensic anthropologists work directly for them now, I think. I'm not sure if they're acting as forensic anthropologists or in a different capacity. I've known a bunch of people of different degrees who have worked for the FBI over the years, but that made me really excited to see them actually take these remains to a forensic anthropologist. And this was probably one of my earliest encounters with forensic anthropology on TV or just at all as a concept. So I knew that Scully was a forensic pathologist. She has her MD, and she specialized in forensic pathology. But if the remains are too far decomposed, or they're already completely skeletal, then you need to take them to a forensic anthropologist in order to analyze those bones. Scully rocks, and so she goes ahead and takes the bones over there, and they found the skull matched a photo of a missing person who was suspected of being one of those victims in 1933. And they can also see human tooth marks near the victim's ribs. Dun dun dun! So this is their first, most legitimate sign of cannibalism, those teeth marks on the actual bone. Before now, Mulder's pretty much just been saying, hey, this guy rips into people's bodies and then eats their livers and leaves the corpse, then hibernates for 30 years and then does it again. But Tooms looks pretty youthful, so it makes Mulder look exceptionally crazy. But in this case, Scully's dedication to science and going by the book has taken her to a forensic anthropologist who has shown her actual tooth marks on the human ribs. So that is really confirming what Mulder was going for, even though he started from perhaps a wackier point than Scully's method of proving it. But that's one of my favorite themes in the X-Files. After she does this, though, she's like, okay, Mulder's been doing this on his own for 3 days, just staking out this guy 24/7. So she decides she's going to go ahead and start surveillance in her car, and Mulder leaves, but Tooms is hiding in his trunk. So last time, Tooms attacked Scully, but this time Mulder's made it kind of personal. He is getting directly in between Tooms and the food chain, and he was about to go back to sleep. He was going to hibernate for another 30 years here in a little bit. So he needs that last liver so he can go back to sleep. I get it. So he's a little cranky, and he follows Mulder home or goes home in his trunk, and then watches him from a grate in Mulder's apartment. And then the next day shows up with his butt kicked and says that Mulder did it. So he shows up at the police station, and Mulder gets in trouble for beating up this guy, who he definitely did not. But they search Mulder's apartment and they find a tennis shoe that matches the shoe print or the imprint on Tooms' jaw. But Mulder does let them know, hey, forensic evidence showed that there was no foot inside that shoe when it connected with his face. That guy's trying to frame me. And Mulder's in Skinner's office having this argument, but the smoking man is just watching in the background. He does a lot of that, just watching. And Scully says that Mulder was on surveillance with her when Tooms was admitted to the hospital. So she just outright lied to her boss and this shadow government agent. And then Skinner kind of, though, sees through it, and he's like, Scully, get out of here, and tells Mulder that he admires him for his talent, but that if he is acting inappropriately, he needs to take a vacation. And Mulder's like, yeah, I do need a vacation. And then he looks at the cigarette smoking man, and Skinner tells Mulder, stay away from Tooms. That otherwise he was going to be fired. He says that all of Mulder's congressional contacts together wouldn't be able to save his career. which I think is also supposed to clue us into the fact that Mulder's also liked by a lot of people who are able to bail him out of stuff. Or, I mean, he doesn't seem the blackmail type, really, Mulder. So, people like him in Congress. He has contacts, or just a rich family. But they use dental records to conclude that the bite marks on the skeletal remains on that rib belonged to Eugene Victor Tooms, and that is enough evidence to go ahead and arrest him. But we go back to Tooms, and he is just seeing his halfway house family leave while he's talking to his doctor, and Tooms just can't handle it anymore. He's so hangry, you guys, and he kills his doctor. So he kills them, eats the liver, and then bails. So Mulder decides, hey, let's go back where we found Tooms before, his old Exeter Street apartment, but that building has since been torn down and a shopping mall is now there. So you're telling me that they tore down a building and put a shopping mall up there in the amount of time it took for this man to go to trial? I don't know if this is just like a really long trial. It seems like it's a really short trial, but also this time for a whole new building to be built here seems like it's also been very compressed. Maybe I just have low expectations from living on the Austin-San Antonio corridor for so many years, but I swear it seems like that kind of thing takes absolutely forever. So I don't know how long it's been. Has it been a year? Are these people particularly industrious or well paid? Even better, are these people just very well paid and are building these things really quickly? Who's to say? I'm not sure. I don't know how much time has actually elapsed here, but they do go and find that there is still a utility passageway below an escalator, and so they go and push through that vent and find this gross cave-like area, and also really gross, biled up newspaper pieces that Tooms has left all over the place, or started to make his nest again. And then, all of a sudden, as they are looking at this, Tooms bursts through the wall at them and attacks them. So he is naked and just seems very much like a non-human animal at this point. He is coming at them like a Wolverine or something. So it really freaks them out, and they go to the escalator, and Mulder turns it on really quick. And that culminates in one of the most memorable deaths from the entirety of the X-Files. And that is Tooms getting dragged and squeezed through an escalator and getting crushed to death in this machine. And that led me to be quite afraid of escalators for pretty much my entire life. I'm always afraid that my shoelaces or something are going to get caught in there, and I see Eugene Victor Tooms every time I see an escalator. This episode has staying power, y'all. You should watch it. But at the end of this episode, Skinner is reading Scully's report, and it's another one that is not necessarily conclusive and orthodox in the way that Skinner would want. And he asks the cigarette smoking man if he believes it. And the cigarette smoking man was like, yeah, duh, of course I do. And then outside, Mulder sees a cocoon in a tree and says he thinks that there's a change coming for the X-Files. I love the cigarette smoking man totally just is like, yeah, of course I believe it. I can't believe you're asking me this right now. There's crazier stuff out there, Skinner. But Skinner is still, I guess, getting new information. So he's having to work between Mulder and the shadow government a little bit. But he's still not quite ready to believe his own ears, really believe what he's reading and what Scully and Mulder are telling him. But he clearly knows that, at least on some level, there's a lot more messed up stuff out there that he's not aware of because he's not part of this shadow agency. He's not in as deep as the cigarette smoking man is. So he may not know for sure, but he seems inclined to believe him, even if he's still very reluctant to do so early on. As I said before, this is one of my absolute favorite episodes, and I really appreciate y'all revisiting it with me today. If you haven't seen it yourself, I encourage you to check it out. I believe The X-Files is on Netflix and Amazon Prime right now, but it seems that everything's on Hulu too, so who knows? It's on one of the three, and maybe all of the three. You should go check it out. It's a great show, and if you're looking for a place to start, then Squeeze followed by Tooms is a great way to get a feel for the creepy elements of the show. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please subscribe to the show, and writing a nice review always really helps us. Also, if you could please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I'd appreciate it. Thank you kindly, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.